The God of His Fathers by Jack London. On every hand stretched the forest primeval, the home of noisy comedy and silent tragedy. Here the struggle for survival continued to wage with all its ancient brutality. Briton and Russian were still to overlap in the land of the rainbow's end. And this was the very heart of it. Nor had Yankee gold yet purchased its vast domain. The wolf pack still clung to the flank of the caribou herd, singling out the weak and the big with calf, and pulling them down as remorselessly as were it 1,000 generations into the past. The sparse aborigines still acknowledged the rule of their chiefs and medicine men, drove out bad spirits, burned their witches, fought their neighbors, and ate their enemies with a relish which spoke well of their bellies. But it was at the moment when the Stone Age was drawing to a close. Already over unknown trails and chartless wildernesses were the harbingers of the steel arriving. Fair-faced, blue-eyed, indomitable men, incarnations of the unrest of their race. By accident or design, single-handed and in twos and threes, they came from no one knew whither, and fought, or died, or passed on, no one knew whence. The priests raged against them, the chiefs called forth their fighting men, and stone clashed with steel, but to little purpose. Like water seeping from some mighty reservoir, they trickled through the dark forests and mountain passes, threading the highways in bark canoes, or with their moccasined feet breaking trail for the wolf dogs. They came of a great breed, and their mothers were many, but the fur-clad denizens of the Northland had this yet to learn. So many an unsung wanderer fought his last, and died under the cold fire of the aurora, as did his brothers in burning sands and reeking jungles, and as they shall continue to do till in the fullness of time the destiny of their race be achieved. It was near 12. Along the northern horizon a rosy glow, fading to the west and deepening to the east, marked the unseen dip of the midnight sun. The gloaming and the dawn were so commingled that there was no night, simply a wedding of day with day, a scarcely perceptible blending of two circles of the sun. A killdee timidly chirped good night. The full, rich throat of a robin proclaimed good morrow. From an island on the breast of the Yukon, a colony of wild fowl voiced its interminable wrongs, while a loon laughed mockingly back across a still stretch of river. In the foreground, against the bank of a lazy eddy, birch-bark canoes were lined 2 and 3 deep. Ivory-bladed spears, bone-barbed arrows, buckskin-thonged bows, and simple basket-woven traps bespoke the fact that in the muddy current of the river the salmon run was on. In the background, from the tangle of skin tents and drying frames, rose the voices of the fisher folk. Bucks skylarked with bucks or flirted with the maidens, while the older squaws, shut out from this by virtue of having fulfilled the end of their existence in reproduction, gossiped as they braided rope from the green roots of trailing vines. At their feet their naked progeny played and squabbled, or rolled in the muck with the tawny wolf dogs. To one side of the encampment, and conspicuously apart from it, stood a second camp of 2 tents. But it was a white man's camp. If nothing else, the choice of position at least bore convincing evidence of this. In case of offense, it commanded the Indian quarters 100 yards away. Of defense, a rise to the ground and the cleared intervening space. And last, of defeat, the swift slope of a score of yards to the canoes below. From one of the tents came the petulant cry of a sick child and the crooning song of a mother. In the open, over the smoldering embers of a fire, two men held talk. I love the church like a good son. Bien. So great a love that my days have been spent in fleeing away from her, and my nights in dreaming dreams of a reckoning. Look you. The half-breed's voice rose to an angry snarl. I am Red River born. My father was white as you. But you are Yankee, and he was British bred and a gentleman's son. And my mother was the daughter of a chief, and I was a man. Aye, and one had to look the second time to see what manner of blood ran in my veins. For I lived with the whites and was one of them, and my father's heart beat in me. It happened there was a maiden, white, who looked on me with kind eyes. Her father had much land and many horses. Also he was a big man among his people, and his blood was the blood of the French. He said the girl knew not her own mind, and talked over much with her, and became wroth that such things should be. But she knew her mind, for we came quick before the priest. And quicker had come her father, with lying words, false promises, I know not what, so that the priest stiffened his neck, and would not make us, that we might live one with the other. As at the beginning it was the church which would not bless my birth, so now it was the church which refused me marriage, and put the blood of men upon my hands. Bien. Thus have I cause to love the church. So I struck the priest on his woman's mouth, and we took swift horses, the girl and I, to Fort Pierre, where was a minister of good heart. But hot on our trail was her father and brothers and other men he'd gathered to him. And we fought, our horses on the run, till I emptied 3 saddles, and the rest drew off and went on to Fort Pierre. Then we took east, the girl and I, to the hills and forests, and we lived one with the other, and we were not married. The work of the good church, which I love like a son. But mark you, for this is the strangeness of woman, the way of which no man may understand. One of the saddles I emptied was that of her father's, and the hoofs of those who came behind had pounded him into the earth. This we saw, the girl and I, and this I had forgot had she not remembered. And in the quiet of the evening, after the day's hunt were done, it came between us. And in the silence of the night, when we lay beneath the stars and should have been one, it was there always. She never spoke, but it sat by our fire and held us ever apart. She tried to put it aside, but at such times it would rise up till I could read it in the look of her eyes, in the very intake of her breath. So in the end, she bore me a child, a woman child, and died. Then I went among my mother's people, that I might nurse at a warm breast and live. But my hands were wet with the blood of men, look you, because of the church, wet with the blood of men. And the riders of the north came for me, but my mother's brother, who was then chief in his own right, hid me, and gave me horses and food. And we went away, my woman child and I, even to the Hudson Bay country, where white men were few and the questions they asked not many. And I worked for the company, a hunter, as a guide, as a driver of dogs, till my woman child was become a woman, tall and slender and fair to the eye. You know the winter, long and lonely, breeding evil thoughts and bad deeds. The chief factor was a hard man and bold, and he was not such that a woman would delight in looking upon. But he cast eyes upon my woman child, who was become a woman, Mother of God, he sent me away on a long trip with the dogs that he might. You understand, he was a hard man and without heart. She was most white, and her soul was white, and a good woman, and, well, she died. It was bitter cold the night of my return, and I had been away months, and the dogs were limping sore when I came to the fort. The Indians and breeds looked on me in silence, and I felt the fear of I knew not what, but I said nothing till the dogs were fed, and I had eaten as a man with work before him should. Then I spoke up, demanding the word, and they shrank from me, afraid of my anger and what I should do. But the story came out, the pitiful story, word for word and act for act, and they marveled that I should be so quiet. When they had done, I went to the factor's house, calmer than now in the telling of it. He had been afraid and called upon the breeds to help him, but they were not pleased with the deed, and had left him to lie on the bed he had made. So he had fled to the house of the priest. Thither I followed, but when I was come to that place, the priest stood in my way, and spoke soft words, and said a man in anger should go neither to the right nor left, but straight to God. I asked by the right of a father's wrath that he give me past, but he said only over his body, and besought with me to pray. Look you, it was the church, always the church, for I passed over his body, and sent the factor to meet my woman-child before his God, which is a bad God, and the God of the white men. Then there was hue and cry, for word was sent to the station below, and I came away. Through the land of the great slave, down the valley of the Mackenzie to the never-opening ice, over the white Rockies, past the great curve of the Yukon, even to this place did I come. And from that day to this, yours is the first face of my father's people I have looked upon. May it be the last. These people, which are my people, are a simple folk, and I have been raised to honor among them. My word is their law, and their priests but do my bidding, else would I not suffer them. When I speak for them, I speak for myself. We ask to be let alone. We do not want your kind. If we permit you to sit by our fires, after you will come your church, your priests, and your gods. And know this, for each white man who comes to my village, him will I make deny his God. You are the first, and I give you grace. So it were well you go, and go quickly. I am not responsible for my brothers, the second man spoke up, filling his pipe in a meditative manner. Hayes Stockard was at times as thoughtful of speech as he was wanton of action, but only at times. But I know your breed, responded the other. Your brothers are many, and it is you and yours who break the trail for them to follow. In time they shall come to possess the land, but not in my time. Already, have I heard, are they on the head reaches of the great river, and far away below are the Russians. Hayes Stockard lifted his head with a quick start. This was startling geographical information. The Hudson Bay post at Fort Yukon had other notions concerning the course of the river, believing it to flow into the Arctic. Then the Yukon empties into Bering Sea, he asked. I do not know, but below there are Russians, many Russians, which is neither here nor there. You may go on and see for yourself. You may go back to your brothers, but up the Kayakuk you shall not go while the priests and fighting men do my bidding. Thus do I command, I, Baptiste the Red, whose word is law, and who am head man over this people. And should I not go down to the Russians, or back to my brothers? Then shall you go swift-footed before your God, which is a bad God, and the God of the white men. The red sun shot up above the northern skyline, dripping and bloody. Baptiste the Red came to his feet, nodded curtly, and went back to his camp amid the crimson shadows and the singing of the robins. Haystockard finished his pipe by the fire, picturing in smoke and coal the unknown upper reaches of the Kyokuk, the strange stream which ended here its Arctic travels and merged its waters with the muddy Yukon flood. Somewhere up there, if the dying words of a shipwrecked sailorman who had made the fearful overland journey were to be believed, and if the vial of golden grains in his pouch attested anything, somewhere up there, in that home of winter, stood the treasure house of the North. And as keeper of the gate, Baptiste the Red, English half-breed and renegade, barred the way. Bah! He kicked the embers apart and rose to his full height, arms lazily outstretched, facing the flushing north with careless soul. Part 2. Haystockard swore harshly in the rugged monosyllables of his mother tongue. His wife lifted her gaze from the pots and pans and followed his in a keen scrutiny of the river. She was a woman of the Teslin country, wise in the ways of her husband's vernacular when it grew intensive. From the slipping of a snowshoe thong to the forefront of sudden death, she could gauge occasion by the pitch and volume of his blasphemy. She knew the present occasion merited attention. A long canoe, with paddles flashing back the rays of the westering sun, was crossing the current from above and urging in for the eddy. Haystockard watched it intently. 3 men rose and dipped, in rhythmical precision, but a red bandana wrapped about the head of one caught and held his eye. "Bill!" he called. "Oh, Bill!" A shambling, loose-jointed giant rolled out of one of the tents, yawning and rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Then he sighted the strange canoe and was wide awake on the instant. "By the jumping Methuselah! That damned sky pilot!" Haystockard nodded his head bitterly, half reached for his rifle, then shrugged his shoulders. "Pot shot him," Bill suggested. "Settle the thing out of hand. He'll spoil us sure if we don't." But the other declined this drastic measure and turned away, at the same time bidding the woman return to her work and calling Bill back from the bank. The 2 Indians in the canoe moored it on the edge of the eddy, while its white occupant, conspicuous by his gorgeous headgear, came up the bank. "Like Paul of Tarsus, I give you greeting. Peace be unto you, and grace before the Lord." His advances were met sullenly and without speech. "To you, Haystockard, blasphemer and Philistine, greeting. In your heart is the lust of mammon, in your mind cunning devils, in your tent this woman whom you live with in adultery. Yet of these divers sins, even here in the wilderness, I, Sturgis Owen, apostle to the Lord, bid you to repent and cast from you your iniquities." "Savior can't, Haystockard broke in testily. "You'll need all you've got and more for Red Baptiste over yonder." He waved his hand toward the Indian camp, where the half-breed was looking steadily across, striving to make out the newcomers. Sturgis Owen, disseminator of light and apostle to the Lord, stepped to the edge of the steep and commanded his men to bring up the camp outfit. Stockard followed him. "Look here," he demanded, plucking the missionary by the shoulder and twirling him about. "Do you value your hide?" "My life is in the Lord's keeping, and I do but work in his vineyard," he replied solemnly. "Oh, stow that. Are you looking for a job of martyrship?" "If he so wills." "Well, you'll find it right here, but I'm going to give you some advice first. Take it or leave it. If you stop here, you'll be cut off in the midst of your labors, and not you alone, but your men. Bill, my wife, who is a daughter of Belial, and hearkeneth not to the true gospel, and myself. Not only do you bring trouble upon yourself, but upon us. I was frozen in with you last winter, as you will well recollect, and I know you for a good man and a fool. If you think it your duty to strive with the heathen, well and good. But do exercise some wit in the way you go about it. This man, Red Baptiste, is no Indian. He comes of our common stock. He is as bull-necked as I ever dared be, and as wild a fanatic the one way as you are the other. When you two come together, he'll be to pay, and I don't care to be mixed up in it. Understand? So take my advice and go away. If you go downstream, you'll fall in with the Russians. There's bound to be Greek priests among them, and they'll see you safe through to Bering Sea. That's where the Yukon empties. And from there, it won't be hard to get back to civilization. Take my word for it and get out of here as fast as God'll let you. He who carries the Lord in his heart and the gospel in his hand hath no fear of the machinations of man or devil, the missionary answered stoutly. I will see this man and wrestle with him. One backslider returned to the fold is a greater victory than 1,000 heathen. He who is strong for evil can be as mighty for good. Witness Saul when he journeyed up to Damascus to bring Christian captives to Jerusalem. And the voice of the Saviour came to him, crying, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? And therewith Paul arrayed himself on the side of the Lord, and thereafter was most mighty in the saving of souls. And even as thou, Paul of Tarsus, even so do I work in the vineyard of the Lord, bearing trials and tribulations, scoffs and sneers, stripes and punishments for his dear sake. Bring up a little bag with the tea and a kettle of water, he called the next instant to his boatman, not forgetting the haunch of caribou and the mixing pan. When his men, converts by his own hand, had gained the bank, the trio fell to their knees, hands and backs burdened with camp equipage, and offered up thanks for their passage through the wilderness and their safe arrival. Hay Stockard looked upon the function with sneering disapproval, the romance and solemnity of it lost to his matter-of-fact soul. Baptiste the Red, still gazing across, recognized the familiar postures, and remembered the girl who had shared his star-roofed couch in the hills and forests, and the woman-child who lay somewhere by bleak Hudson's Bay. Part 3. Confound it, Baptiste. Couldn't think of it. Not for a moment. Grant that this man is a fool and of small use in the nature of things, but still, I can't give him up. Hay Stockard paused, striving to put into speech the rude ethics of his heart. He's worried me, Baptiste, in the past and now, and caused me all manner of troubles, but can't you see he's my own breed? White, and why I couldn't buy my life with his, not if he was a nigger. So be it, Baptiste the Red made answer. I have given you grace and choice. I shall come presently with my priests and fighting men, and either I shall kill you or you deny your God. Give up the priest to my pleasure, and you shall depart in peace. Otherwise, your trail ends here. My people are against you to the babies. Even now the children stolen away your canoes. He pointed down the river. Naked boys had slipped down the river from the point above, cast loose the canoes, and by then had worked them into the current. When they had drifted out of rifle shot, they clambered over the sides and paddled ashore. Give me the priest, and you may have them back again. Come, speak your mind, but without haste. Stockard shook his head. His glance dropped to the woman of the Teslin country with his boy at her breast, and he would have wavered had he not lifted his eyes to the men before him. I am not afraid, Sturgis Owen spoke up. The Lord bears me in his right hand, and alone am I ready to go into the camp of the unbeliever. It is not too late. Faith may move mountains. Even in the 11th hour may I win his soul to the true righteousness." "Trip the beggar and make him fast," Bill whispered hoarsely in the ear of his leader, while the missionary kept the floor and wrestled with the heathen. "Make 'em hostage and bore 'em if they get ugly." "No," Stockard answered. "I gave him my word that he could speak with us unmolested. Rules of warfare, Bill, rules of warfare. He's been on the square, giving us warning and all that, and why, damn it, man, I can't break my word." "He'll keep his, never fear." "Don't doubt it, but I won't let a half-breed outdo me in fair dealing. Why not do what he wants? Give him the missionary and be done with it." "No," Bill hesitated doubtfully. "Shoe pinches, huh?" Bill flushed a little and dropped the discussion. Baptiste the Red was still waiting the final decision. Stockard went up to him. "It's this way, Baptiste. I came to your village minded to go up the Kayakuk. I intended no wrong. My heart was clean of evil. It's still clean. Along comes this priest, as you call him. I don't bring him here. He'd have come whether I was here or not. But now that he is here, being of my people, I've got to stand by him, and I'm going to. Further, it'll be no child's play. When you've done, your village will be silent and empty, your people wasted as after a famine. True, we will be gone, likewise the pick of your fighting men, but those who remain shall be in peace, nor shall the word of strange gods and the tongues of strange priests be buzzing in their ears." Both men shrugged their shoulders and turned away, the half-breed going back to his own camp. The missionary called his two men to him, and they fell into prayer. Stockard and Bill attacked the few standing pines with their axes, felling them into convenient breastworks. The child had fallen asleep, so the woman placed it on a heap of furs and lent a hand in fortifying the camp. 3 sides were thus defended, the steep declivity at the rear precluding attack from that direction. When these arrangements had been completed, the 2 men stalked into the open, clearing away here and there the scattered underbrush. From the opposing camp came the booming of war drums and the voices of the priests stirring the people to anger. "Worst of it is, they'll come in rushes," Bill complained as they walked back with shouldered axes. "And wait till midnight when the light gets dim for shooting. Can't start the ball a-rolling too early then." Bill exchanged the axe for a rifle and took a careful rest. One of the medicine men, towering above his tribesmen, stood out distinctly. Bill drew a bead on him. "All ready?" he asked. Stockard opened the ammunition box, placed the woman where she could reload in safety, and gave the word. The medicine man dropped. For a moment there was silence, and then a wild howl went up and a flight of bone arrows fell short. "I'd like to take a look at the beggar," Bill remarked, throwing a fresh shell into place. "I'll swear I drilled him clean between the eyes." Didn't work. Stockard shook his head gloomily. Baptiste had evidently quelled the more warlike of his followers, and instead of precipitating an attack in the bright light of day, the shot had caused a hasty exodus, the Indians drawing out of the village beyond the zone of fire. In the full tide of his proselyting fervor, borne along by the hand of God, Sturgis Owen would have ventured alone into the camp of the unbeliever, equally prepared for miracle or martyrdom. But in the waiting which ensued, the fever of conviction died away gradually as the natural man asserted itself. Physical fear replaced spiritual hope. The love of life, the love of God. It was no new experience. He could feel his weakness coming on and knew it of old time. He had struggled against it and been overcome by it before. He remembered when the other men had driven their paddles like mad in the van of a roaring ice flood, how at the critical moment, in a panic of worldly terror, he had dropped his paddle and besought wildly with his God for pity. And there were other times. The recollection was not pleasant. It brought shame to him that his spirit should be so weak and his flesh so strong. But the love of life, he could not strip it from him. Because of it had his dim ancestors perpetuated their line. Because of it was he destined to perpetuate his. His courage, if courage it might be called, was bred of fanaticism. The courage of Stockard and Bill was the adherence to deep-rooted ideals. Not that the love of life was less, but the love of race tradition more. Not that they were unafraid to die, but that they were brave enough not to live at the price of shame. The missionary rose, for the moment swayed by the mood of sacrifice. He half crawled over the barricade to proceed to the other camp, but sank back, a trembling mass, wailing, "As the Spirit moves! As the Spirit moves! Who am I that I should set aside the judgments of God? Before the foundations of the world were all things written in the book of life. Worm that I am, shall I erase the page or any portion thereof? As God wills, so shall the Spirit move." Bill reached over, plucked him to his feet, and shook him fiercely, silently. Then he dropped the bundle of quivering nerves and turned his attention to the two converts. But they showed little fright and a cheerful alacrity in preparing for the coming passage at arms. Stockard, who'd been talking in undertones with the Thessalon woman, now turned to the missionary. "Fetch him over here," he commanded of Bill. "Now," he ordered, when Sturgis Owen had been duly deposited before him, "make us man and wife and be lively about it." Then he added apologetically to Bill, "No telling how it's to end, so I just thought I'd get my affairs straightened up." The woman obeyed the behest of her white lord. To her the ceremony was meaningless. By her light she was his wife, and had been from the day they first foregathered. The converts served as witnesses. Bill stood over the missionary, prompting him when he stumbled. Stockard put the responses in the woman's mouth, and when the time came, for want of better, ringed her finger with thumb and forefinger of his own. "Kiss the bride," Bill thundered, and Sturgis Owen was too weak to disobey. "Now baptize the child." "Neat and tidy," Bill commented. "Gathering the proper outfit for a new trail," the father explained, taking the boy from the mother's arms. "I was grub-staked once into the Cascades and had everything in the kit except salt. Never shall forget it. And if the woman and the kid cross the divide tonight, they might as well be prepared for potluck. A long shot, Bill, between ourselves, but nothing lost if it misses." A cup of water served the purpose, and the child was laid away in a secure corner of the barricade. The men built the fire, and the evening meal was cooked. The sun hurried round to the north, sinking closer to the horizon. The heavens in that quarter grew red and bloody. The shadows lengthened, the light dimmed, and in the somber recesses of the forest life slowly died away. Even the wild fowl in the river softened their raucous chatter and feigned the nightly farce of going to bed. Only the tribesmen increased their clamor, war drums booming and voices raised in savage folk songs. But as the sun dipped, they ceased their tumult. The rounded hush of midnight was complete. Stockard rose to his knees and peered over the logs. Once the child wailed in pain and disconcerted him. The mother bent over it, but it slept again. The silence was interminable, profound. Then, of a sudden, the robins burst into full-throated song. The night had passed. A flood of dark figures boiled across the open. Arrows whistled and both thongs sang. The shrill-tongued rifles answered back. A spear and a mighty cast transfixed the Thessalon woman as she hovered above the child. A spent arrow, diving between the logs, lodged in the missionary's arm. There was no stopping the rush. The middle distance was cumbered with bodies, but the rest surged on, breaking against and over the barricade like an ocean wave. Sturgis Owen fled to the tent. while the men were swept from their feet, buried beneath the human tide. Haystockard alone regained the surface, flinging the tribesmen aside like yelping curs. He had managed to seize an axe. A dark hand grasped the child by a naked foot and drew it from beneath its mother. At arm's length, its puny body circled through the air, dashing to death against the logs. Stockard clove the man to the chin and fell to clearing space. The ring of savage faces closed in, raining upon him spear thrusts and bone-barbed arrows. The sun shot up, and they swayed back and forth in the crimson shadows. Twice, with his axe blocked by too deep a blow, they rushed him, but each time he flung them clear. They fell underfoot, and he trampled dead and dying, the way slippery with blood. And still the day brightened, and the robins sang. Then they drew back from him in awe, and he leaned breathless upon his axe. "Blood of my soul," cried Baptiste the Red, "but thou art a man. Deny thy God, and thou shalt yet live." Stockard swore his refusal, feebly but with grace. "Behold, a woman!" Sturgis Owen had been brought before the half-breed. Beyond a scratch on the arm, he was uninjured, but his eye roved about him in an ecstasy of fear. The heroic figure of the blasphemer, bristling with wounds and arrows, leaning defiantly upon his axe, indifferent, indomitable, superb, caught his wavering vision, and he felt a great envy of the man who could go down serenely to the dark gates of death. Surely Christ, and not he, Sturgis Owen, had been molded in such a manner. And why not he? He felt dimly the curse of ancestry, the feebleness of spirit which had come down to him out of the past, and he felt an anger at the creative force, symbolize it as he would, which had formed him, its servant, so weakly. For even a stronger man, this anger and the stress of circumstance were sufficient to breed apostasy, and for Sturgis Owen it was inevitable. In the fear of man's anger, he would dare the wrath of God. He'd been raised up to serve the Lord only that he might be cast down. He'd been given faith without the strength of faith. He'd been given spirit without the power of spirit. It was unjust. "Where now is thy God?" the half-breed demanded. "I do not know." He stood straight and rigid, like a child repeating a catechism. "Hast thou then a God at all?" "I had." "And now?" "No." Haystockard swept the blood from his eyes and laughed. The missionary looked at him curiously, as in a dream. A feeling of infinite distance came over him, as though of a great remove. In that which had transpired, and which was to transpire, he had no part. He was a spectator. At a distance, yes, at a distance. The words of Baptiste came to him faintly. "Very good. See that this man go free, and that no harm befall him. Let him depart in peace. Give him a canoe and food. Set his face toward the Russians, that he may tell their priests of Baptiste the Red, in whose country there is no God." They led him to the edge of the steep, where they paused to witness the final tragedy. The half-breed turned to Haystockard. "There is no God," he prompted. The man laughed in reply. One of the young men poised a war spear for the cast. "Hast thou a God?" "Aye, the God of my fathers." He shifted the axe for a better grip. Baptiste the Red gave the sign, and the spear hurtled full against his breast. Sturgis Owen saw the ivory head stand out beyond his back, saw the man sway, laughing, and snap the shaft short as he fell upon it. Then he went down the river, that he might carry to the Russians the message of Baptiste the Red, in whose country there was no God. 1,000 deaths, by Jack London. I had been in the water about an hour, and cold, exhausted, with a terrible cramp in my right calf, it seemed as though my hour had come. Fruitlessly struggling against the strong ebb tide, I had beheld the maddening procession of the waterfront lights slip by. But now I gave up attempting to breast the stream and contented myself with the bitter thoughts of a wasted career now drawing to a close. It had been my luck to come of good English stock, but of parents whose account with the bankers far exceeded their knowledge of child nature and the rearing of children. While born with a silver spoon in my mouth, the blessed atmosphere of the home circle was to me unknown. My father, a very learned man and a celebrated antiquarian, gave no thought to his family, being constantly lost in the abstractions of his study, while my mother, noted far more for her good looks than her good sense, sated herself with the adulation of the society in which she was perpetually plunged. I went through the regular school and college routine of a boy of the English bourgeoisie, and as the years brought me increasing strength and passions, my parents suddenly became aware that I was possessed of an immortal soul and endeavored to draw the curb. But it was too late. I perpetrated the wildest and most audacious folly and was disowned by my people, ostracized by the society I had so long outraged. And with the £1,000 my father gave me, with the declaration that he would neither see me again nor give me more, I took a first-class passage to Australia. Since then, my life has been one long peregrination, from the Orient to the Occident, from the Arctic to the Antarctic, to find myself at last, an able seaman at 30, in the full vigor of my manhood, drowning in San Francisco Bay because of a disastrously successful attempt to desert my ship. My right leg was drawn up by the cramp, and I was suffering the keenest agony. A slight breeze stirred up a choppy sea, which washed into my mouth and down my throat, nor could I prevent it. Though I still contrived to keep afloat, it was merely mechanical, for I was rapidly becoming unconscious. I have a dim recollection of drifting past the sea wall and of catching a glimpse of an upriver steamer's starboard light. Then everything became a blank. I heard the low hum of insect life and felt the balmy air of a spring morning fanning my cheek. Gradually, it assumed a rhythmic flow to whose soft pulsations my body seemed to respond. I floated on the gentle bosom of a summer sea, rising and falling with dreamy pleasure at each crooning wave. But the pulsations grew stronger, the humming louder, the waves larger, fiercer. I was dashed about on a stormy sea. A great agony fastened upon me. Brilliant, intermittent sparks of light flashed athwart my inner consciousness. In my ears there was the sound of many waters. Then a sudden snapping of an intangible something, and I awoke. The scene of which I was protagonist was a curious one. A glance sufficed to inform me that I lay on the cabin floor of some gentleman's yacht in a most uncomfortable posture. On either side, grasping my arms and working them up and down like pump handles, were two peculiarly clad, dark-skinned creatures. Though conversant with most aboriginal types, I could not conjecture their nationality. Some attachment had been fastened about my head, which connected my respiratory organs with the machine I shall next describe. My nostrils, however, had been closed, forcing me to breathe through my mouth. Foreshortened by the obliquity of my line of vision, I beheld two tubes, similar to small hosing, but of different composition, which emerged from my mouth and went off at an acute angle from each other. The first came to an abrupt termination and lay on the floor beside me. The second traversed the floor in numerous coils, connecting with the apparatus I have promised to describe. In the days before my life had become tangential, I dabbled not a little in science, and conversant with the appurtenances and general paraphernalia of the laboratory, I appreciated the machine I now beheld. It was composed chiefly of glass, the construction being of that crude sort which is employed for experimentative purposes. A vessel of water was surrounded by an air chamber, to which was fixed a vertical tube surmounted by a globe. In the center of this was a vacuum gauge. The water in the tube moved upwards and downwards, creating alternate inhalations and exhalations, which were in turn communicated to me through the hose. With this, and the aid of the men who pumped my arms so vigorously, had the process of breathing been artificially carried on, my chest rising and falling, and my lungs expanding and contracting, till nature could be persuaded to again take up her wonted labor. As I opened my eyes, the appliance about my head, nostrils, and mouth was removed. Draining a stiff 3 fingers of brandy, I staggered to my feet to thank my preserver and confronted my father. But long years of fellowship with danger had taught me self-control, and I waited to see if he would recognize me. Not so. He saw in me no more than a runaway sailor and treated me accordingly. Leaving me to the care of the blackies, he fell to revising the notes he had made on my resuscitation. As I ate of the handsome fare served up to me, confusion began on deck, and from the chanties of the sailors and the rafting of blocks and tackles, I surmised that we were getting under way. What a lark! Off on a cruise with my recluse father into the wide Pacific. Little did I realize, as I laughed to myself, which side the joke was to be on. Had I known, I would have plunged overboard and welcomed the dirty forecastle from which I had just escaped. I was not allowed on deck till we had sunk the Farallones and the last pilot boat. I appreciated this forethought on the part of my father, and made it a point to thank him heartily in my bluff seaman's manner. I could not suspect that he had his own ends in view, in thus keeping my presence secret to all save the crew. He told me briefly of my rescue by his sailors, assuring me that the obligation was on his side, as my appearance had been most opportune. He had constructed the apparatus for the vindication of a theory concerning certain biological phenomena, and had been waiting for an opportunity to use it. "You have proved it beyond all doubt," he said, then added with a sigh, "but only in the small matter of drowning." But, to take a reef in my yarn, he offered me an advance of £2 on my previous wages to sail with him, and this I considered handsome, for he really did not need me. Contrary to my expectations, I did not join the sailors' mess forward, being assigned to a comfortable stateroom and eating at the captain's table. He had perceived that I was no common sailor, and I resolved to take this chance for reinstating myself in his good graces. I wove a fictitious past to account for my education and present position, and did my best to come in touch with him. I was not long in disclosing a predilection for scientific pursuits, nor he in appreciating my aptitude. I became his assistant, with a corresponding increase in wages, and before long, as he grew confidential and expounded his theories, I was as enthusiastic as himself. The days flew quickly by, for I was deeply interested in my new studies, passing my waking hours in his well-stocked library, or listening to his plans and aiding him in his laboratory work. But we were forced to forego many enticing experiments, a rolling ship not being exactly the proper place for delicate or intricate work. He promised me, however, many delightful hours in the magnificent laboratory for which we were bound. He had taken possession of an uncharted South Sea island, as he said, and turned it into a scientific paradise. We had not been on the island long before I discovered the horrible mare's nest I had fallen into. But before I describe the strange things which came to pass, I must briefly outline the causes which culminated in as startling an experience as ever fell to the lot of man. Late in life, my father had abandoned the musty charms of antiquity and succumbed to the more fascinating ones embraced under the general head of biology. Having been thoroughly grounded during his youth in the fundamentals, he rapidly explored all the higher branches as far as the scientific world had gone, and found himself on the no-man's land of the unknowable. It was his intention to preempt some of this unclaimed territory, and it was at this stage of his investigations that we had been thrown together. Having a good brain, though I say it myself, I had mastered his speculations and methods of reasoning, becoming almost as mad as himself. But I should not say this. The marvelous results we afterwards obtained can only go to prove his sanity. I can but say that he was the most abnormal specimen of cold-blooded cruelty I have ever seen. After having penetrated the dual mysteries of physiology and psychology, his thought had led him to the verge of a great field for which, the better to explore, he began studies in higher organic chemistry, pathology, toxicology, and other sciences and sub-sciences rendered kindred as accessories to his speculative hypotheses. Starting from the proposition that the direct cause of a temporary and permanent arrest of vitality was due to the coagulation of certain elements and compounds in the protoplasm, he had isolated and subjected these various substances to innumerable experiments. Since the temporary arrest of vitality in an organism brought coma, and a permanent arrest death, he held that by artificial means this coagulation of the protoplasm could be retarded, prevented, and even overcome in the extreme states of solidification. Or, to do away with the technical nomenclature, he argued that death, when not violent, and in which none of the organs had suffered injury, was merely suspended vitality, and that in such instances, life could be induced to resume its functions by the use of proper methods. This, then, was his idea: to discover the method, and by practical experimentation prove the possibility of renewing vitality in a structure from which life had seemingly fled. Of course, he recognized the futility of such endeavor after decomposition had set in. He must have organisms which but the moment, the hour, or the day before had been quick with life. With me, in a crude way, he had proved this theory. I was really drowned, really dead when picked from the water of San Francisco Bay, but the vital spark had been renewed by means of his aerotherapeutical apparatus, as he called it. Now to his dark purpose concerning me. He first showed me how completely I was in his power. He had sent the yacht away for a year, retaining only his two blackies, who were utterly devoted to him. He then made an exhaustive review of his theory and outlined the method of proof he had adopted, concluding with the startling announcement that I was to be his subject. I had faced death and weighed my chances in many a desperate venture, but never in one of this nature. I can swear I am no coward, yet this proposition of journeying back and forth across the borderline of death put the yellow fear upon me. I asked for time, which he granted, at the same time assuring me that but the one course was open: I must submit. Escape from the island was out of the question. Escape by suicide was not to be entertained, though really preferable to what it seemed I must undergo. My only hope was to destroy my captors. But this latter was frustrated through the precautions taken by my father. I was subjected to a constant surveillance, even in my sleep being guarded by one or the other of the blacks. Having pleaded in vain, I announced and proved that I was his son. It was my last card, and I had played all my hopes upon it. But he was inexorable. He was not a father, but a scientific machine. I wonder yet had it ever come to pass that he married my mother or begat me, for there was not the slightest grain of emotion in his makeup. Reason was all in all to him, nor could he understand such things as love or sympathy in others, except as petty weaknesses which should be overcome. So he informed me that in the beginning he had given me life, and who had better right to take it away than he? Such, he said, was not his desire, however. He merely wished to borrow it occasionally, promising to return it punctually at the appointed time. Of course, there was a liability of mishaps, but I could do no more than take the chances, since the affairs of men were full of such. The better to ensure success, he wished me to be in the best possible condition, so I was dieted and trained like a great athlete before a decisive contest. What could I do? If I had to undergo the peril, it were best to be in good shape. In my intervals of relaxation, he allowed me to assist in the arranging of the apparatus and in the various subsidiary experiments. The interest I took in all such operations can be imagined. I mastered the work as thoroughly as he, and often had the pleasure of seeing some of my suggestions or alterations put into effect. After such events, I would smile grimly, conscious of officiating at my own funeral. He began by inaugurating a series of experiments in toxicology. When all was ready, I was killed by a stiff dose of strychnine and allowed to lie dead for some 20 hours. During that period, my body was dead. Absolutely dead. All respiration and circulation ceased, but the frightful part of it was that while the protoplasmic coagulation proceeded, I retained consciousness and was enabled to study it in all its ghastly details. The apparatus to bring me back to life was an airtight chamber fitted to receive my body. The mechanism was simple. A few valves, a rotary shaft and crank, and an electric motor. When in operation, the interior atmosphere was alternately condensed and rarefied, thus communicating to my lungs an artificial respiration without the agency of the hosing previously used. Though my body was inert, and for all I knew in the first stages of decomposition, I was cognizant of everything that transpired. I knew when they placed me in the chamber, and though all my senses were quiescent, I was aware of hypodermic injections of a compound to react upon the coagulatory process. Then the chamber was closed and the machinery started. My anxiety was terrible, but the circulation became gradually restored. The different organs began to carry on their respective functions, and in an hour's time, I was eating a hearty dinner. It cannot be said that I participated in this series, nor in the subsequent ones, with much verve. But after 2 ineffectual attempts at escape, I began to take quite an interest. Besides, I was becoming accustomed. My father was beside himself at his success, and as the months rolled by, his speculations took wilder and yet wilder flights. We ranged through the 3 great classes of poisons, the neurotics, the gaseous, and the irritants, but carefully avoided some of the mineral irritants and passed the whole group of corrosives. During the poison regime, I became quite accustomed to dying and had but one mishap to shake my growing confidence. Scarifying a number of blood vessels in my arm, he introduced a minute quantity of that most frightful of poisons, the arrow poison, or curare. I lost consciousness at the start, quickly followed by the cessation of respiration and circulation, and so far had the solidification of the protoplasm advanced that he gave up all hope. But at the last moment he applied a discovery he'd been working upon, receiving such encouragement as to redouble his efforts. In a glass vacuum, similar but not exactly like a Crookes tube, was placed a magnetic field. When penetrated by polarized light, it gave no phenomena of phosphorescence, nor the rectilinear projection of atoms, but emitted non-luminous rays, similar to the X-ray. While the X-ray could reveal opaque objects hidden in dense mediums, this was possessed of far subtler penetration. By this, he photographed my body and found on the negative an infinite number of blurred shadows due to the chemical and electric motion still going on. This was an infallible proof that the rigor mortis in which I lay was not genuine. That is, those mysterious forces, those delicate bonds which held my soul to my body were still in action. The resultants of all other poisons were unapparent, save those of mercurial compounds, which usually left me languid for several days. Another series of delightful experiments was with electricity. We verified Tesla's assertion that high currents were utterly harmless by passing 100,000 volts through my body. As this did not affect me, the current was reduced to 2,500, and I was quickly electrocuted. This time he ventured so far as to allow me to remain dead, or in a state of suspended vitality, for 3 days. It took 4 hours to bring me back. Once he superinduced lockjaw, but the agony of dying was so great that I positively refused to undergo similar experiments. The easiest deaths were by asphyxiation, such as drowning, strangling, and suffocation by gas, while those by morphine, opium, cocaine, and chloroform were not at all hard. Another time, after being suffocated, he kept me in cold storage for 3 months, not permitting me to freeze or decay. This was without my knowledge, and I was in a great fright on discovering the lapse of time. I became afraid of what he might do with me when I lay dead, my alarm being increased by the predilection he was beginning to betray towards vivisection. The last time I was resurrected, I discovered that he'd been tampering with my breast. Though he had carefully dressed and sewed the incisions up, they were so severe that I had to take to my bed for some time. It was during this convalescence that I evolved the plan by which I ultimately escaped. While feigning unbounded enthusiasm in the work, I asked and received a vacation from my moribund occupation. During this period, I devoted myself to laboratory work, while he was too deep in the vivisection of the many animals captured by the blacks to take notice of my work. It was on these two propositions that I constructed my theory. First, electrolysis, or the decomposition of water into its constituent gases by means of electricity, and second, by the hypothetical existence of a force, the converse of gravitation, which Astor has named apergy. Terrestrial attraction, for instance, merely draws objects together but does not combine them. Hence, apergy is merely repulsion. Now, atomic or molecular attraction not only draws objects together but integrates them. And it was the converse of this, or a disintegrative force, which I wished to not only discover and produce, but to direct at will. Thus, the molecules of hydrogen and oxygen reacting on each other separate and create new molecules containing both elements and forming water. Electrolysis causes these molecules to split up and resume their original condition, producing the two gases separately. The force I wish to find must not only do this with two, but with all elements, no matter in what compounds they exist. If I could then entice my father within its radius, he would be instantly disintegrated and sent flying to the four quarters, a mass of isolated elements. It must not be understood that this force, which I finally came to control, annihilated matter. It merely annihilated form. Nor, as I soon discovered, had it any effect on inorganic structure. But to all organic form, it was absolutely fatal. This partiality puzzled me at first, though had I stopped to think deeper, I would have seen through it. Since the number of atoms in organic molecules is far greater than in the most complex mineral molecules, organic compounds are characterized by their instability and the ease with which they are split up by physical forces and chemical reagents. By two powerful batteries connected with magnets constructed specially for this purpose, two tremendous forces were projected. Considered apart from each other, they were perfectly harmless, but they accomplished their purpose by focusing at an invisible point in midair. After practically demonstrating its success, besides narrowly escaping being blown into nothingness, I laid my trap. Concealing the magnets so that their force made the whole space of my chamber doorway a field of death, and placing by my couch a button by which I could throw on the current from the storage batteries, I climbed into bed. The Blackies still guarded my sleeping quarters, one relieving the other at midnight. I turned on the current as soon as the first man arrived. Hardly had I begun to doze when I was aroused by a sharp metallic tinkle. There on the mid-threshold lay the collar of Dan, my father's St. Bernard. My keeper ran to pick it up. He disappeared like a gust of wind, his clothes falling to the floor in a heap. There was a slight whiff of ozone in the air, but since the principal gaseous components of his body were hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, which are equally colorless and odorless, there was no other manifestation of his departure. Yet, when I shut off the current and removed the garments, I found a deposit of carbon in the form of animal charcoal. Also other powders, the isolated solid elements of his organism, such as sulfur, potassium, and iron. Resetting the trap, I crawled back to bed. At midnight, I got up and removed the remains of a second black, and then slept peacefully till morning. I was awakened by the strident voice of my father, who was calling to me from across the laboratory. I laughed to myself. There had been no one to call him, and he had overslept. I could hear him as he approached my room with the intention of rousing me, and so I sat up in bed, the better to observe his translation. Perhaps apotheosis were a better term. He paused a moment at the threshold, then took the fatal step. Puff! It was like the wind sighing among the pines. He was gone. His clothes fell in a fantastic heap on the floor. Besides ozone, I noticed the faint garlic-like odor of phosphorus. A little pile of elementary solids lay among his garments. That was all. The wide world lay before me. My captives were no more.